Good afternoon to you all, and you are once again welcome to this afternoon's class. Today, the lecture is going to center on perception. So, we are going to treat how individuals interpret sensory information in their environments and usually rely on this information to make decisions. By the end of the lecture, students are expected to be in a position to define what perception is. Then they're also expected to identify the factors which influence perception, which include the perceiver, the object, and then the context or situation within which the perception occurs. And students are also expected to use attribution theory to explain how perception occurs. And students are also expected to identify some errors that can be committed in an attempt to perceive sensory information in our environment. And finally, we will also learn about perception and judgment, whether they matter, especially when we rely on perceptual information to make decisions. And we will also consider some of the errors that we can encounter in decision making. So, definitionally, perception can be explained as a process by which individuals organize and interpret their sensory impressions in order to give meaning to their environment. And by sensory impressions, we are referring to the impressions we gain from our environment when we rely on our sensory data, be it our ears, our eyes, our nose, our mouth, and our sense of feeling, which is tactile. Now, it is important to study perception in the field of organizational behavior because people's behavior are based on their perception of what reality is or not, or of what reality is, not on reality is. In other words, the way we behave, as we learned earlier on, is influenced by a number of factors, of which perception is one of it. And because of our perception or the sensory impressions we use to give meaning to our environments, it kind of helps us to create our own reality, which is different from the reality which exists out there. And so the way things appear to us is as a result of our perception. And this appearance may be different from the truth or the reality existing out there. And so this aspect of OB will help you to appreciate why people behave differently from you. And usually it is originating from the decisions they are making out of their perceptions. To understand what all of us have in common in our interpretation of reality out there, we need to begin with the factors that influence our perception. So basically, what are the factors that influence the way we organize and interpret our sensory impressions in order to give meaning to them? What are the factors? Research indicates that three main factors influence the perception we give to reality out there. And these factors include the perceiver, the object or target being perceived. And thirdly, the context or situation in which the perception is being made. So the three main factors are the perceiver, the target, and the context within which perception is being made. So let's take them in turns. By perceiver, we are referring to the individual who is looking at the target or attempting to interpret what he or she sees. So if I am trying to look at the sun, in this scenario, I becomes the perceiver, and I am trying to make sensory impressions out of the sun as it sets. Now, that interpretation is also heavily influenced by the person's personal characteristics. Okay, so if I'm looking at the sun, my personal characteristics will inform the interpretations I get out of it, out of my sensory independence. So for instance, when I talk about my personal characteristics, it includes my attitude, my motives, my interests, past experiences, and expectations. So if, for instance, I have an expectation that the sun rises from the east and sets at the west, and I am gazing at it, then I will be using this background to be making interpretations. If my past experience tells me that in Africa, by 6 p.m., the sun should set, and by 6 a.m., the sun should be rising, then all this will influence the interpretations I make. So the perceiver is very much key when it comes to our interpretation or the influence of perception. The second factor is the targets. And the characteristics of the targets have also been identified in research as very much influential to what we perceive. And by targets, if you liken it to the sun analogy I gave, the sun becomes the target. So the object or the thing that you are trying to use your sensory data to make meaning out of becomes the target or the object. And because we do not look at targets in isolation, the relationship of the target to its background influences perception, as does our tendency to group close things and similar things together. So we can perceive women, men, white, Africans, and Muslims because such people have a lot of commonalities, and when you look at them, they fall within the same continuum. So that is about the targets, or also known as the object. Now, the context, the situation within which the perceiver and the targets occur has also been identified to matter too. The time at which we see an object or event can influence our attention, as can the location, the light, heat, or situational factors. For instance, at a club on Saturday night, you may not notice someone fancily dressed, yet that same person in that attire for your Monday morning management class will suddenly catch your attention. Neither in this particular scenario that I'm talking about, neither the perceiver nor the target has changed, because we are talking about the same fancy dress, and they say another individual wearing it. But between Sunday night and Monday morning, the situation is different. Okay, so the situation now is that we have moved from a club to a management classroom. And that is where we are perceiving the same fancy dress differently. Okay. This means that the context also matters a lot when it comes to its influence on our perception. So to summarize the factors that influence our perception, research is saying that there are three main factors, and these include the perceiver, the targets or objects, and the situation or context. By perceiver, the perceiver is also influenced by their personal characteristics, such as their attitude, motives, interests, experiences, and expectations. Now, by targets, we're also saying that the novelty of the target, the motion, the size, the sound, the background, proximity, and similarity can also influence the perception we make out of the objects. Then, as far as the situation is concerned, the timing, the work setting, or the social environment within which the perception occurs can also influence our final interpretations. Now, there are a number of theories that have been advanced to explain why perception occurs the way it does, and why we also tend to interpret our sensory information and make such meaning out of it. But at this level, we are going to focus on the attribution theory. Now, the attribution theory contends that when we observe an individual's behavior, we attempt to determine whether it is internally caused or externally caused. In other words, if I say, if I record one of my students being absent in class today, such level of absenteeism can be attributed to the person being intrinsically lazy, or the person not getting an external resource, such as means of transportation, or not getting car to come to school. That is why the person was late. That is what basically the attribution theory is saying, that at any point in time when we observe an individual's behavior, we attempt to determine whether the behavior was caused by an internal source or an external source. So, like I mentioned in the absenteeism example, if someone is absent in my class, I could attribute it to an internal or external source. And if I say the person is absent because we can trace it to his internal source, it means that intrinsically the person is lazy, or the person does not like my class. Now, if we try to attribute it to an external cause, then the theory will be saying that we are targeting something which is outside the individual, which could be as a result of no means of transport to school, as a result of no lorry fare, as a result of you can't say as a result of rainfall, and so on and so forth, anything outside the individual. So clarification of the differences between external and internal causation. When we say the cause of a particular behavior can be attributed as internally caused, it means that we are referring to those that are believed to be under the person's personal control. Okay, so the person decides not to come because he's feeling bored that particular day. But when we say it is externally caused, it means supervening events or unforeseen circumstances are thwarting or truncating one's ability to come to class. So it is resulting from an external cause, usually not under your control. That determination depends also largely on three factors. So whether it is internal or external cause also depends on three further factors, which include the distinctiveness, the consensus, and the consistency of the behavior. How distinct is the behavior which is occurring? So if it is absenteeism, is this something that is very much distinct to only that individual, or it is something that the entire class is experiencing, and so they were all absent? The consensus. So is it connected to everyone in the class? And consistency, is it being repeated frequently, and so on and so forth? So let's look at them in detail. When we talk about the distinctiveness of the behavior, it refers to whether an individual displays different behaviors in different situations. We can, what we want to know is whether the behavior is usual or unusual. If it is, we are likely to, so if it is unusual, we are likely to give it an external attribution because it is not something which occurs frequently. Okay, so because it is now one out of a lot or out of the blue moon, then we can see that maybe something extraneous has occurred. That is why it is preventing the person. If it is not, so which means it is usual, then we will probably judge the behavior to be internal. So we are likely to attribute it to be internal if it is something that is recurring. And in that regard, it is very typical of the person, and it is more or less like a trait in him. Now, consensus also occurs if everyone who faces with a similar situation responds in the same way. So that was why I was saying that if the absenteeism is not peculiar to only one student, but the entire students did not come, then it is possible for us to attribute it to something external and not internal. However, if it is peculiar to only one individual, then we can say it is attributable to what? Internal. So from an attributional perspective, if consensus is high, you would probably give an external attribution. And by saying consensus is high, it means the entire class were absent in that particular day, as in the example I gave. And so external attribution to employees' tardiness or laziness. Whereas if other employees who took the same route made it to the work on time, you would attribute one's lateness to an internal cause. So in this particular scenario, we are comparing a situation where there is a particular route to get to workplace, and we are verifying whether all the entire workforce were late or only one person was late. So if the entire workforce was late, then there is consensus, and for that matter, we will attribute it to an external cause, that maybe the route was convoluted. But if it is only an individual who was late out of the lot, then we can attribute it to internal cause and blame the person for being sloppy or lazy. Now, consistency. With respect to consistency, we are interested in verifying whether the person responds the same way over time. The more consistent the behavior, the more we are inclined to attribute it to an internal cause. And the more inconsistent a behavior, then the higher the likelihood of attributing it to an external cause. Okay. So this is a pictorial explanation of the attribution theory, which simply says that we try to explain an individual behavior by making reference to the source being internal or external. And these are also contingent on three further factors, which are the distinctiveness, the consensus, and consistency. And the various permutations have been made over here. So this is basically to summarize it for you pictorially so that it will stick in your mind. Now, in an attempt to perceive or to make meaning using our sensory data, there are chances that we will commit errors. And so these are the perceptual errors. And research indicates that errors or biases distort attribution. When we make judgments about the behavior of other people, we tend to understand the influence of external factors and overestimate the influence of internal factors. And this is what we call fundamental attribution error. So what we are going to do primarily under the perceptual errors is that I'll be taking you through the various types of errors that you can commit in an attempt to perceive your environment, relying on your sensory data. So the first one is fundamental attribution error. And this is an error which occurs anytime we underestimate the influence of external factors whilst overestimating the influence of internal or personal factors. Now, fundamental attribution error can explain why a sales manager attributes false performance of her sales agents to laziness, that is, the sales agent being lazy, rather than a competitor's innovative product line. So if your sales agent is unable to achieve their performance target, and so they are lagging behind. Now, instead of holistically looking at it to see where it is coming from, whether it is because your competitors are using a superior strategy, but you rather blame the sales agent. Once this occurs, then fundamental attribution error has occurred. So individuals and organizations tend to attribute their own success to internal factors, such as ability or effort, while blaming failure on external factors, such as bad luck or difficult co-work. So in this particular scenario, you realize the manager is blaming poor performance on sales agents. Okay. All right. Then the second perceptual error that individuals can commit in an attempt to make sense of their environment is self-serving bias. Self-serving bias. And self-serving bias refers to the tendency for individuals to attribute their own success to internal factors and put the blame for failures on external factors. Okay, so we are saying that you are attributing your success to internal factors, and you are putting blame for failure on external factors. Okay, people tend to attribute ambiguous information as relatively flattering, accept positive feedback, and reject negative feedback. And when this occurs, then we say self-serving bias has occurred. So I will entreat you to be paying attention to some of these things, particularly for the objective quizzes that we'll be doing. So the main difference between the fundamental attribution error and the self-serving bias is that in the fundamental attribution error, the individual is embarking on estimations. Okay, whereas in the self-serving bias, the individual is apportioning blame. Okay. Now, a number of ways have also been identified as the shortcuts individuals use in making judgment about others. And some of these include selective perception, and they all contribute to the perceptual errors. So in selective perception, what happens? Any characteristics that makes a person, an object or event stand out will increase the probability that it will be perceived. Since we can observe everything going on, since we can't observe everything going on around us, we engage in selective perception. So selective perception refers to the tendency to selectively interpret what one sees on the basis of one's interests, background, experiences, and attitude. In selective perception, what is happening is that we are constantly bombarded with a lot of information which all our sensory data cannot monitor. So because of the inadequacy of our senses, we are able to focus on the ones that are readily perceivable, and then the ones which are not easily perceivable are attenuated through our sensory organs. And for that matter, anytime we are relying on some of these perceptions to make decisions, we have to be very, very cautious, because at the end of the day, we are analyzing and we are perceiving and making analysis of these perceptions based on our interests, background, experiences, and attitude. And this might be different from individual to individual. The second issue is what we call halo effect. And halo effect occurs when we draw a general impression on the basis of a single characteristic. An example is that, for instance, we are conducting an interview, and the moment one of the interviewees enters, a panel member takes a decision that this is a good candidate for the job by virtue of the person's appearance, the way the person has dressed. Okay, once this is done, then we say halo effect has occurred, because the panel member is drawing a general impression on the basis of a single characteristic, which is the first impression that they got. Now, the next perceptual error is what we call contrast effect or contrast error. And in contrast error, it means that we do not evaluate a person in isolation. We do not evaluate a person in isolation. Our reaction to one person is influenced by other persons we have recently encountered. Let me give an example. Assuming I am marking your end of semester paper, okay, and I have already prepared my marking scheme, which I am supposed to follow to mark all of you accordingly. However, we can say contrast effect has occurred when, after marking the first person, I used the outcome, whether the person did very, very well as the yardstick to mark the remaining papers. In other words, because the first person did very well, I am using that standard as the benchmark to evaluate the remaining ones. Once this occurs, and I shift away from my marking scheme to the use of the first person I mark to evaluate the remaining one, then contrast effect, that's okay. Then the second one is stereotyping or stereotyping error, which is something that I think I mentioned in our previous lecture. Stereotyping simply means that you are judging someone on the basis of our perception of the group to which they belong. So, because he is a female, then I'm judging the person on the basis of feminine stereotypes. Because the person is an Ashanti, then I'm using Ashanti stereotypes to judge the person, and so on and so forth. There is a link between the perception we make and the decision that we also make. Now, research indicates that our perception generates some amount of information which can also be relied upon to embark on a decision making. And individuals in organizations have been identified to constantly making decisions. That is choosing from two or more alternatives. And top managers in particular determine goals, products to offer, how to finance operations, or locate a new plant. Middle level managers and lower level managers have also been identified to determine product schedules and select employees and decide about pay raises. Some non-managerial employees are now also empowered to make decisions that have been previously made by managers. So we are saying over here that all these stakeholders in an organization periodically embark on some form of decision making, which are almost always contingent or influenced by their perception. So there is the need for us to be very much concerned about some of these errors which can occur during the formation of our percepts, in the sense that once these errors are not dealt with, it can also influence our decision making, and this can have deleterious consequences on the productivity or performance of our organization. So decision making occurs as a reaction to a problem, and usually when we are trying to take a decision, it means that there is an impending problem or hurdle that we intend to jump, and there is the need for us to weigh between alternatives in order to take the most appropriate solution for the problem. And there is a discrepancy between some current states and some desired states. So the problem could be that currently there is a discrepancy between some current state of affairs and some desired states. That is what we currently find ourselves in, and the projections that we make for ourselves in the future, requiring consideration of alternative course of action. So there is the need for decision. One's problem is another man's satisfactory state of affairs. So that is where the differences in perception comes in. Because whereas someone might be perceiving that this problem is a no-go area, another person might also be perceiving that this problem is a Herculean one and needs to be tackled tactfully. So every decision requires interpretation and evaluation of information. And in that circumstance, data are typically received from multiple sources. And there is the need for us to decide on which data are relevant to the decision and which are not. So alternatives will be developed. and strengths and weaknesses of each need to be evaluated. So if your perception is clouded with huge amounts of errors, then some of these decision making to resolve a problem may be truncated and can actually affect you. So to contain some of these perceptual errors and to assist us in making judicious decisions, research has offered the rational model of decision making. And it is trying to say that we often think the best decision maker is rational and make consistent, value maximizing choices within specified constraints. So that is the main proposition that the rational model of decision making is advancing. And it also continues that rational decision making process follows 6 steps as shown here. So when we say there are 6 steps, it means you cannot mix them. If you mix them, then you encounter problems. So what are these 6 steps? The first step is the definition of the problem. And this is where the problem is carefully explained for all the stakeholders to understand the task which needs to be resolved. And this has to be unequivocally explained so that it will bring clarity to the people that are trying to champion solutions to it. And after defining the problem, there is the need for identification of the decision criteria. So having defined the problem, you have to identify the criteria that you are going to use to make the decision. Whether this criteria will be the reliance on past occurrence or past archival data, or there is a need for brainstorming exercise to be conducted to generate a novel approach to resolving the problem, and so on and so forth. So all these things need to be identified. Then, having identified a number of these decision criteria, we also need to allocate weights to the criteria. So if, for instance, we say we are going to rely on a criteria which is existing in our archive, what sort of premium do we put on it, or how much trust can we invest in this criteria? Is this something that has yielded favorable results in the time past? And so on and so forth. Now, in order not to be found wanting, the 4th stage also indicates that there is the need to develop alternatives. So we don't have to rely on only the criteria that we have in our archive. We often see that the business environment is constantly changing. And so we have to get plan Bs, plan B. And these plan Bs are the alternatives that we are talking over here. So that if the initial criteria does not yield favorable results, then we quickly switch to get the problem solved. And having developed these alternative criteria, then we also have to evaluate them to see which of them is pretty much feasible and an apt solution for the problem at hand. So having weighed and evaluated these alternatives, then we can finally select the best alternative out of the lot. And this then gets implemented to see whether it can actually solve the problem. So the rational decision model is it's not a one-time kind of thing. In other words, when you move from the problem definition to the selection of the best alternative, at the end of the day, we are looking for results. So if you implement it and it does not solve the problem, then you have to move on to the next alternative until you are able to get an appreciable solution for your problem. Now, in the course of decision making, research also indicates that there are a number of biases or errors that can crop up. And so we are going to look at some of these biases. The first one is what we call overconfidence bias. And as the name suggests, it refers to the tendency to be too confident. You believe in yourself too much about the ideas that might keep some from planning how to avoid problems that arise. So the individual becomes excessively complacent by believing that the plan A they have will yield favorable results. And so they do not even think about alternatives that can be implemented as far as plan Bs are concerned. Individuals whose intellectual and interpersonal abilities are weakest are the most likely to overestimate their performance ability. And this is what research is saying. The second decision bias is what we call anchoring bias. So when we talk about anchor, think about the anchor of ship. Okay. So anchoring bias is a situation where an individual is fixated on initial information as a starting point and failing to adequately adjust for subsequent information. So let's think about the current COVID-19 pandemic we are experiencing. Initially, when news broke out that there is a new novel virus spreading in the Wuhan province in China, the WHO issued a communique that the world should be on alert and that we have to start protecting ourselves towards this virus. Then, so that was the initial information that came about the virus. Now, later on, further research indicated that the COVID-19 virus is actually airborne. And so we have to escalate our protection mechanisms by using nose masks and also embarking on social distancing. So quickly, we switched from the, how do you call it? The norm, which is moving about our business without using any protective gadgets, to the use of the protective nose mask, sanitizers, and so on and so forth. So anchoring bias would have occurred if after all those warnings from WHO, we were fixated that, oh, this thing is not too risky, it's not airborne, so we are not going to use this protective bias, okay? All right, and the third one that we are going to look at is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias. And this is a type of bias which occurs, it's particularly akin to selective perception, and it involves an individual seeking out information that reaffirms their past choices and discounting information that contradicts their judgments. And this usually occurs when students are conducting research. You see, before they even go out, they have an answer in their mind. And so whenever they go out there and they get different opinion or answers, then they do not report that one. They only end up reporting answers that actually confirms what they already have in their mind. And anytime that occurs, then we say confirmation bias has occurred, because you are in your decision making, you are picking information which are important to you, and you are rejecting the ones which are not important. So at the end of the day, we are not getting the holistic picture. The fourth one is what we call availability bias. And availability bias refers to the tendency for people to base judgment on information that is readily available. And it is a bias because the decision making or the judgment is premised on information that is currently available, and it does not take into consideration unforeseen, or it does not go further to unravel unavailable information. So it means that the decision is based on inadequate data to be making such judgments. And that is where the bias is coming from. The fifth one is what we call escalation of commitment. And as the name suggests, escalation of commitments occurs when an individual stays with a decision, even when there are clearer evidence that it is wrong. So escalation is mostly likely to occur when individuals view themselves as responsible for the outcome. Okay, so it's like initially it was a common knowledge that the world was, the earth was flat. Okay, and later on, Copernicus argued that if indeed the world was flat, then when you are moving from one point to the other, you should be able to see the sun static. At some point in time, the sun vanishes and it comes, it vanishes and it comes. In the same way, when you are standing on a mountain, then you are expected to see the sea level or the ocean, but that is not the case. And so he challenged that assumption that the earth was flat. Now, assuming, despite all these arguments that he makes, which are pretty much cogent, we still heed to the advice that the earth is flat, then we can say that we are pretty much committed to our earlier evidence. And so escalation of commitment has occurred. Randomness error. That one too, the name suggests it's straightforward. It refers to our tendency to believe that we can predict the outcome of random events when we actually do not have the capacity to do that. So decision making becomes impaired when we try to create meaning out of random events, simply because our decision rule is premised on randomness, which we do not have control over. No one has control over randomization. Risk aversion. Risk aversion also occurs in situations where we prefer a sure or predictable thing instead of a risky outcome. So research indicates that ambitious people with power that can be taken away appear to be especially risk averse because they don't want to take any risk that can affect them so that they lose their power. So such people are always afraid to take risk. And research also indicates that people will more likely engage in risk-seeking behaviors for negative outcomes and risk-averse behaviors for positive outcomes. That is, people engage in risk-seeking behaviors because the outcomes are likely to be negative, and risk-averse behavior for positive outcomes. So that was why we were saying that people want to protect their power because, and that is why they were trying to be risk-averse. Okay, hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is used by the pastors a lot in Ghana. It refers to the tendency to believe falsely that one has accurately predicted the outcome of an event after that outcome is actually known. So when WHO was making a lot of projections about the devastating nature of COVID-19, all of a sudden, the pastors also started making pronouncements that a lot of people are going to get sick, people are going to die, and so on and so forth. When in actual fact, in all our dailies and televisions, news about the upward surge of the COVID-19 cases was ongoing. And so on what basis were they trying to prophesy about some of these things? All these things are what we call hindsight bias. They already knew the facts and they were just trying to be mischievous. So that will be all for today's lecture. And once again, I'll entreat you to carefully go over it to understand some of these biases and errors. Thank you.